Jim is the partner and chief operating officer at the Asia Group and a member of the executive committee. Prior to joining the Asia Group, he spent 22 years with the Department of State as a career Foreign Service officer and member of the Senior Foreign Service. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in East Asia and Pacific Affairs. He was there during the pivot to Asia time. He also had a high-level position at USTR on the National Security Council. In China, he led the embassy, Beijing's trade policy office. And in Singapore, his work was instrumental in facilitating negotiations for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And then before that, he spent 15 years as a Navy officer, and he left the naval service with the rank of commander, and is a veteran of Operation Desert Storm. So that's quite an illustrious career, Jim. And so with that, I'll go ahead and let you get started, and then we'll take some questions and comments after your talk.
Great. Thanks so much for that introduction, Stan, and thank you, Deb, and all of you for welcoming me as a speaker. The World Affairs Councils are so important, I think, in ensuring that Americans stay connected to what's happening overseas and understand that so much of what makes this country strong and healthy and prosperous and influential really does start at the water's edge. So I commend you all for, taking the time to devote yourself to understanding what happens abroad, how it impacts the United States, and hopefully, you're taking that message and helping it expand to a younger generation. So, I spoke to Stan earlier, and what he advised was maybe that I take 20 to 30 minutes and just deliver some remarks and then leave plenty of time for questions. So that's what I'll do. And I thought, even though you've had some other speakers engage you on China, I believe most recently, I think it's good to remind ourselves, why is Asia important? And in this case, when we talk about Asia, when we talk about Asia now in the foreign affairs community, it's really the Indo-Pacific. So that's stretching all the way from India to Japan in the Northeast, all the way down to Australia, and then of course also including the Pacific. So it's, you're talking about a part of the world that represents 65% of the global population, has a very young population, over 750 million between the ages of 15 and 24, 2 billion people in the middle class. And it's also a region that accounts for over 60% of global GDP. And keep in mind that the US is about 15% of global GDP. So really dwarfed by what Asia represents. Indo-Pacific also accounts for 2/3 of global economic growth. So it is really the engine of growth that is important to the U.S. when it comes to investment, to U.S. exports, to where we source a lot of everyday items that we come to depend on. And in this year, China is probably going to be the only major economy that grows. When we talk about the flows of trade and people, 60% of maritime trade passes through the South China Sea, between 30 and 40% of global energy. So we are really dependent on the sea lanes of communication staying open, the ability for navigation in the air and on the water. And when you think about the security challenges that confront the United States, almost all of them reside in the Indo-Pacific. You've got 6 nuclear weapon states. If you want to include North Korea as a nuclear weapon state, I mean, clearly they have nuclear weapons. We don't accept them as a nuclear weapon state, but certainly it's a volatile region with respect to weaponry. This is a region that is seeing the fastest growing defense budgets, proliferation of missile systems, expansion of navies. And as you see, there's contested borders, China and India being the latest example, but also in the waters of the South China Sea, the East China Sea. Any of those could at any moment, kind of explode into, a hot contest. And that's something that, we very much need to focus on if we want to keep those sea lanes of communication open. When you think about the global challenges that confront not only the United States, but the world, whether that's climate change or as we're experiencing now with COVID, global health impacts. A lot of that comes from the Indo-Pacific. This is a region that is the largest emitter of carbon dioxide. It's an area where coal as a primary use of energy is actually increasing. And these are crowded populations where we do see disease emerging, where you have, still the, wet markets where COVID is suspected of having emerged in Wuhan. So, these are challenges that are going to confront the United States, whether we are willing to confront them ourselves, or if we're just going to sit, within the U.S. borders and wait for them to impact us. As they come our way, either through, disease, through travel, or conflict that impacts our ability to conduct commerce and invest. And obviously, from the career that I came from, we don't want to sit back and wait for those challenges to arrive on our doorstep. We want to shape them, and we want to try to shift them in a direction that is in our national interest, as well as the world's. So, if you all agree with me that the Indo-Pacific is an area that's going to be critical to our future, to the history of the 21st century, then as we look at the arrival of the Biden administration, I think we're confronted with a number of questions, and I think there's a lot that's still, I think, unknown. President Biden is going to enter a situation where he is going to be forced to spend a lot of his energies focused on domestic challenges, whether that's healthcare, the COVID, or the economic recession. I guarantee you his domestic advisors are going to want him focused on those issues as they look to the midterm election, which, the campaigning for that is going to start in a year and a half. The Georgia Senate races, I think, are going to be a tremendous impact, because if the Republicans hold the Senate, then that is going to mean a delay in the ability of the Biden administration to get officials confirmed, not only at the cabinet level, but at the important levels of the assistant secretaries and undersecretaries and ambassadors. These are the people that go out and conduct the foreign policy, that shake hands, that propose initiatives, that lay the groundwork for progress that can be made at the head of state level. And if you don't have them in place, then the machinery really doesn't move. There's always the big question of what is the relative weight of the Indo-Pacific versus other regions. When President Obama came into office, what sparked the imagination on the pivot to Asia was the fact that the U.S. at that point had devoted tremendous blood and treasure and national wealth to the conflicts in the Middle East. And the Obama administration believed that not enough attention had been paid to the Indo-Pacific. I think remains to be seen how the Biden administration is going to weight the president's attention, but also the attention of his senior officials. Tony Blinken, who's been nominated for Secretary of State, or will be nominated for Secretary of State, is certainly played a role in Asia when he was Deputy Secretary of State, but he is, I think, at heart and through his experience, more of a Europeanist. So, we'll have to see where he devotes his attention. And I think, a big question that I think we all have to think about is, it's not like the rest of the world is going to say, okay, the U.S. Had 4 years of President Trump, and now there seems to be a return to a more conventional style of engagement with the rest of the world, and that the rest of the world is just going to kind of return to where they were 4 years ago. And that's not going to be the case at all. There is going to be a degree of overhang. There's going to be skepticism. There's going to be a sense that, hey, President Trump won 71 million votes. What's to prevent, somebody who comes from the same school of thought returning to office in 4 years and rolling back and undoing anything that a President Biden does? And so, I think we have to expect that as Biden administration officials head out and talk about initiatives or trying to gain cooperation, whether it's a common approach to China or on climate change or on security matters, foreign governments are going to be forced to really think about how much do they want to get out on a limb for the United States. When foreign governments weigh the pros and cons of cooperating with the United States, they're oftentimes balancing their relationship with China and other major powers. And as they experienced either with Paris or with the Paris Climate Change Agreement or with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, they got left holding the bag, after years and years of negotiations. And so I think, we're going to have to wait and see how long it takes to, pick up where things left off and whether some real progress can be made in some of these really thorny challenges. So, there's been obviously a few announcements so far in terms of personnel. I think before I get to personnel, I think philosophically how I expect the Biden administration to approach foreign policy is, there's going to be a much greater emphasis on alliances, on U.S. participation in multilateral fora. So, putting the America First rhetoric to the back, and I think let's all admit, look, American interests are always first and foremost, right? That's when you're elected to office in the United States or you're a U.S. official. Of course, U.S. interests are what's most important, but there's a difference between understanding U.S. interests, and then considering them to be so far in front of others' interests that we don't do. We don't consult, that we don't look for common approaches that lift all boats. And I think, that is going to be the approach that I would expect the Biden administration to take. So with respect to multilateral fora, in Asia, that would be active presidential engagement in things like APEC, the East Asia Summit, which is with the Southeast Asian nations, the Quad with Japan, India, and Australia. And these are important because these send a message to other governments that, we're going to try to limit surprises, that we're going to talk about ways in which we can cooperate to ensure that not just U.S. interests are the driving factor in policy decisions, but that we're also considering others. You can expect that, we will rejoin the Paris Climate Accords, the World Health Organization, possibly the Iran deal. I think, we'll have to wait and see on that. One thing where I think there will be some continuity, at least from a strategic perspective, is the approach to China. There's really been a giant shift and a bipartisan shift in how both Republicans and Democrats view China. And, there are elements of what the Trump administration did that were needed, but much of that was done from a unilateral perspective, did not involve consultations with European partners, with Japan, with Korea, Australia, et cetera. And if there's one thing that the Chinese are really concerned about, it's when you have large economies that are cooperating together to try to condition Chinese behavior, in ways that, kind of compel them to align with, what we would expect to see, whether that's on trade or national security policy, or how it treats its neighbors, how it honors the law of the sea, et cetera. So, expect that engagement to take place as the Biden administration thinks about China, and not all governments are going to want to get out and lean out as front as the U.S. may be, but there is definitely going to be a common denominator, perhaps on trade and economic practices, that can help make our policy more compelling and more effective. I do think there will be efforts to try to identify some areas of cooperation with the Chinese. There's no doubt that you can't address global health, climate, non-proliferation challenges without the Chinese at the table. It's just impossible. So there is going to have to be an effort to strike the balance between competition, confrontation in some cases, but also cooperation. On climate change, quite evident that President-elect Biden is going to place great emphasis on that by naming John Kerry as his climate czar. We're going to have to wait and see how effective that is. It's a common practice to name policy czars in all sorts of areas, but whether or not they have teeth and whether or not there's the ability to gain traction is always a different discussion. Certainly, Secretary Kerry has plenty of experience in this domain. He's got, tremendous prestige and relationships around the world. So certainly if there's anyone who can try to move the ball forward on climate change, I think he's definitely, at the top of the list. On trade policy, I expect the Biden administration to have a somewhat muted approach. Again, the domestic policy advisors are going to be focused on midterm elections, and trade is a bit like kryptonite at this point. And so, talk of free trade, at least from a rhetorical perspective, is now equated with shipping jobs abroad, and that's going to make it difficult to either rekindle U.S. participation in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or even advance bilateral trade agreements that have been discussed, possibly with Taiwan or other markets in the Indo-Pacific. True to historical norms, expect the Biden administration to pay more attention to human rights and democracy. I wouldn't expect it to necessarily override other elements, facets of policy, as, for instance, Bill Clinton, when he came into office and kind of predicated his China policy on human rights, and that had to go by the wayside because it's not a practical lens to kind of guide all policy decisions. It certainly has always been an important one in American policy. The challenge is always balancing it between kind of what is realistic and where does and what is the idealistic components of a human rights and democracy initiative, and to what degree do you allow human rights, democracy concerns to kind of derail engagement and cooperation in other areas. The other thing that I would expect is some administrations come into office and their policy as it relates to the Indo-Pacific kind of tends to revolve around major powers like China. China, is the most important one that gets the most important visits. It's where all the engagement happens, and the risk is that other partners, whether they're allies or just like-mindeds, tend to feel like they're second, third, fiddles. In the Obama administration, there was a very concerted effort to embed China within a broader Asia policy. So when Secretary of State Clinton made her first trip abroad, it was to Asia, but Beijing was not the stop that she went to. She went to allies, she went to Indonesia, and it was meant to be a very clear message that the United States didn't view the Indo-Pacific through the China lens. And I would expect, based on the personnel that have been named so far, that the Biden administration would take that a similar approach, which I think is the healthy approach, because I think if you're engaging China and the Chinese don't believe that you prioritize other relationships and that those other relationships are going to shape your policy decisions and priorities, then you're basically giving them leverage. And so it's an absolute must that for us to engage China, we have to be doing so with the confidence that we are coordinating with others in the region, and where there's room for cooperation, that we're finding ways to secure that. And maybe I'll end up with a bit of commentary on the personnel that President-elect Biden has named so far. So Tony Blinken as Secretary of State, not a big surprise at all. Some folks had thought maybe that that Rice might have a shot, but I think without the Senate, there was always a sense that getting her confirmed would be difficult because of Benghazi. But I think Tony was always at the top of the list, given his history with the president-elect, and also the fact that he has deep experience at the State Department from his time as Deputy Secretary. Jake Sullivan as National Security Advisor, also not a surprising pick. Jake was one of Secretary Clinton's top advisors when she was Secretary of State. He's an incredibly sharp, thoughtful, person, and we worked very close with him on Asia policy. So I think that's a good development for those of us who want to see engagement with Asia at the forefront. Jake gets it. He was very involved in it, and I think he'll do a great job there. I don't think we don't have, everyone presumes that Michelle Flournoy will be nominated for Secretary of Defense. And then, I think the other picks on Intel are also not a surprise. But as I noted earlier, it's the undersecretaries and the assistant secretaries who do the kind of the grunt work from a foreign policy perspective. And so, we really need to wait and see who those people are. We need to wait and see how long it takes for them to get confirmed. Even at the fastest, you don't see those people get confirmed until summer, usually. Given the kind of the dire states of our politics right now, and if depending on how the Georgia runoffs go, that could really throw a wrench in things in terms of getting people into the right positions. So I think I'm at my half hour with that. Why don't I turn it over to you, Deb and Stan, to see if there's any questions?
Thank you very much, Jim. We want to invite our members to go ahead and write your questions in the chat so that we can ask them of the speaker. And I get to start with the first one. Under the Biden administration, will the United States see a return to being the moral authority in the world and in China regarding the promotion of democratic principles and human rights?
Well, look, I hope so. I mean, I do think that we've injured ourselves with I think how we've conducted ourselves in this election. I mean, what people see on the news on a daily basis is alarming. I mean, when I talk to friends overseas, what I try to tell them is, look, the silver lining is that our system and our checks and balances, our courts, they worked. And but we have some black eyes. So I think the world has long looked to us in that regard as a beacon for human rights and democracy. And I think they want to see us regain that stature. And so I just hope that they allow us to do that.
Thank you. Thank you. Stan, I'm not sure what other questions you see on your end.
Okay, well, here, so I have a question here that a national news agency today stated that Biden's appointments indicate that the US will be going backwards. Do you agree? And how do you see US policy in Asia going forward? And China going forward, yeah.
So I don't know if I saw that. Is that Senator Rubio's comments, or is this just a editorial or what?
You know what? I think that was an editorial on Fox News.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, look, I've seen some. I saw Senator Rubio came out today and kind of criticized the Blinken and other picks and said this was more run of the mill, Ivy League elites that don't really kind of reflect where the United States is. And look, I mean, the politics are the politics. I think, look, if going backwards means, kind of embracing alliances, participating in multilateral fora, in engaging in consulting with others, vice acting unilaterally, then I guess, yes, you can say that we're going backwards. But for those of us who believe that that's the right approach, it's not going backwards. It's a return to a prudent and effective approach.
Okay, I have a question here from Nick Moeller, and he asked, what do you think will happen with North Korea? The current edition of The Economist expects North Korea to test Biden early and hard, and for China not to help us with this.
Mm-hmm. Yes, the North Korean playbook is certainly that they would test us, fairly early in the Biden administration. I think there's, you never know kind of what communication is taking place behind the scenes. Certainly, Kim Jong-un received unprecedented attention through his 2 summits with President Trump. Would be unrealistic for him to think that he's going to just jump right into a summit with President Biden. President Biden will take a more conventional approach whereby, he's going to have advisors and others who will negotiate with North Korea to try to arrive at some, understandings that maybe could be advanced in high level negotiations. For the Chinese, look, it's in China's interest for North Korea to kind of constantly be just below the boiling point. It destabilizes, it serves as a distraction, as an area for possible cooperation, but it also kind of guarantees some degree of heat that they can try to demonstrate a more helpful approach. They don't want to see outright conflict, but they also don't want to see us embracing North Korea in a way that would somehow, unite North and South Korea and have U.S. troops on China's border, right? So, where they like to keep it is in that zone where there's friction and a need for engagement. And so they're not going to want Kim Jong-un to be too provocative. But I think, they most likely expect that he's going to conduct some missile tests. My guess is they are probably sending messages to him right now saying, do not conduct a nuclear test. Don't fire any long range intercontinental ballistic missiles towards the United States, that sort of thing. But yes, certainly the North Koreans will test the new administration early.
Okay.
Thank you. Kind of a follow-up question to that. Do you think the United States and China might ever partner in monitoring the development of nuclear weapons in the region? Or will there be more of a Cold War bilateral approach?
think that's hard to tell. I mean, certainly, certainly it's in China's and the U.S. interest for there not to be, additional proliferation in the Indo-Pacific, region such that you have more nuclear powers. The challenge right now with U.S. and China is there's just so much distrust, and it's awfully hard to see how you get back to a level, in relatively short order where we're working with China, actively on that front. It certainly is an area that I'm sure President-elect Biden and his national security team is going to want to focus on. But I don't know if they're going to first focus on the agreements with Russia, and then possibly with China. But there are going to be other priorities.
Okay, I'm going to go next to Tim Oak. He has to go off and teach a class. He's a professor of Chinese geographer at University of Colorado in Boulder and the chair of the Center for Asian Studies. And he has a couple of interesting, very kind of complicated questions. So Tim, are you still there? Can you unmute and ask those questions?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Jim, for your talk. It's really interesting, and I was just curious about what your take on the recently signed RCEP agreement. What's the acronym? A regional.
Yeah, the Regional Conference of Economic Partnership.
Yeah, and whether or not that'll spur a re-engagement or restart on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But I guess I'm most interested in what you might, think the impact on Southeast Asia would be. There's been a lot of stuff coming out recently. David Chamba has a new book coming out. Don Emerson has a collection that's been focusing a lot on the need for the U.S. to re-engage in Southeast Asia, particularly because there's so much activity going on there with China. And Shamba's been talking about how that would be the new kind of economic front in which the U.S. could re-engage in kind of challenging China's presence there. And so it's a complicated question whether or not RCEP has a role to play in that, and whether or not you think the U.S. is going to be engaging more in Southeast Asia under a Biden administration. Thank you.
Sure. Well, I mean, the RCEP agreement is meaningful when you look certainly at the economies that are participating. It's not a high quality agreement. It doesn't really. It's not cutting edge. When it's mostly about tariffs, so not a lot on services and investment, intellectual property, the digital economy, et cetera. So, I think the jury's probably still out in terms of to what degree does that agreement itself kind of spur growth in trade and investment. I think where it's important is it demonstrated the ability of a pretty large and unwieldy group of economies to, actually arrive at an agreement. When you think about what produces trade agreements, right? It's these small teams of negotiators from different governments who have to rely on a degree of trust and national interest and industry interest and what's politically feasible, right, to arrive at a common set of agreements. And you don't just parachute people in and have an effective negotiation. So basically, though, all of these governments that have been involved in RCEP and that also concluded the TPP success agreement have been keeping those relationships fresh, are on the leading edge of understanding kind of where the go, no-go zones are for negotiating partners. And we've been on the sidelines now, right? And so we're rusty. We've lost a lot of the people that were negotiating the TPP have retired. And so where it really hurts us is, the ability to even restart, right? There's been an intellectual drain. There's kind of a loss of understanding and knowledge of kind of the texture of the negotiating, kind of lay of the land in the region. And we burned a lot of bridges with our TPP decision. I mean, that was probably the biggest kind of strategic blunder that I think the Trump administration made. And it basically it created a huge vacuum that the Chinese have exploited. Now, I will tell you that the region desperately wants us engaged, right? I mean, we are still the largest investor in Asia. Our companies are admired and do more for those economies, right? In terms of hiring locals and training them and bringing skill sets and corporate governance that is appreciated. So, anywhere in Asia, there is a strong desire for American companies to invest and for Americans to be active economic participants. But I just think that it's going to be awfully difficult now for, if you're the incoming Biden team, you don't, you have a slim margin in the House that you could easily lose at the midterm. At best, you have a tie in the Senate. The question is, what do you try to get done? Is it, a big infrastructure deal that jumpstarts the economy? Is it healthcare? Those are the things that ultimately voters are going to be more interested in 2 years for the midterm elections. They're not going to care about the TPP. And the problem with a trade agreement right now is the rhetoric on it is just, it's not conducive to, winning a national election, right? Every time somebody gets laid off, well, that was the fault of whatever trade agreement. So, what really needs to happen in the United States is we need to rebuild the consensus on trade. People don't understand how trade impacts their lives. They don't understand, if they're in manufacturing, what percentage of what they produce actually goes to a foreign market. People that go to Walmart don't understand that the reason why they're paying affordable prices for clothing is because they're imported. And until the average American understands that trade is important and that, we need to have trade agreements to compete fairly, then, we're kind of stuck where we are. I mean, my understanding is polls show that the majority of Americans support trade, but there's a disconnect between that and, how politicians talk about kind of what somebody's support for trade agreement X meant. I mean, the Trump approach was the tried and true approach when it came to NAFTA, right? You say the deal sucks, I'm going to make it better. I rename it, and now it's the best thing ever, right? And that's what he should have done with TPP. It's possible that Biden could try to do the same thing. The question is whether or not the other members would be willing to make, the changes that would allow the Biden administration to say it's much better now. So, I'm not hopeful as much as I think we need to move on that front. I just don't. I think it's going to be very difficult.
Okay, so just continuing along those lines, we have a question from Richard Moeller. He's a retired senior foreign service officer, former consul general to Hong Kong. And he writes that it strikes me that the Democrats and Biden administration must deliver for the American people in the next 2 to 4 years. Jobs, healthcare income, and less contentious politics. Otherwise, Republicans will say same old, and it'll lead to Republican comeback in 2022 and 2024. So what are the prospects for Biden?
Well, I mean, that goes to my point, right? Which is how much time are you going to be able to really spend on foreign policy and initiatives, whether it's climate or on trade? Because I agree. I think, the challenge is in 2 years, if you've tried to do too much and then you lose both the House and you have a bigger gap in the Senate, then you're basically, you're a bit of a lame duck, because I don't know how many people expect that, Biden runs for a second term. He'd be 82 years old. So that is the central challenge. I mean, can the administration walk and chew gum at the same time, try to advance the ball on key domestic priorities while also, moving the ball on the foreign policy front? And look, some of that can happen with just getting people out and having real conversations and listening. But when it comes to, actually, trying to change the trajectory of problems, whether it's climate change or proliferation, et cetera, that takes executive attention. And I think that's going to be, at a premium given the challenges that President Biden will face.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions on regional China issues. Crystal asked, what do you see for Hong Kong policy changes? And then Jeffrey Kolb asks, do you see China testing the Biden administration regarding Taiwan?
Yeah, I mean, look, Hong Kong is a challenge, and I think we can expect that Xi Jinping is going to continue to turn the screws on Hong Kong. He's never liked Hong Kong, and he doesn't think it's as necessary as it once was, and is certainly not going to kind of roll back the approach that he's been taking in terms of a tighter grip on the legislative council, on freedom of speech, or the press, assembly, et cetera. So that's just, I mean, that's going to continue to be a bad news story, and there doesn't seem to be any concern from the Chinese part that they're going to pay a price for that somehow. On Taiwan is always a volatile issue. The Trump administration has definitely pushed the envelope much more so than previous administrations, starting with Trump when he was president-elect, taking the call from his Taiwanese counterpart. The fact that he has announced many more weapon sales than the previous administration. He's also sent higher level officials to Taiwan, most recently the Undersecretary of State, and I think the EPA administrator may be going. So look, I support a strong relationship with Taiwan. I'd like to see us negotiate a free trade agreement with Taiwan. And I think Taiwan is probably more important now, particularly when you think about what's happening with technological decoupling with China, a trend which is most likely going to continue because that is an area of, I think, of national security concern for us. And the Taiwanese have a globally leading semiconductor industry, as well as other high tech industries, and so we should be doing what we can to strengthen their economy and to give them optionality. Because they're increasingly sucked into, China's economic shadow, and the best thing we can do for them right now would be to give them some options. It is always a bit of a, it's the gray line is very narrow in terms of how far can you go before the Chinese feel like, they have to do something dramatic. And nobody really, I think, can tell you exactly where that line is, and how much more could we do to try to strengthen that relationship. But certainly, I think the Chinese expectation is going to be that there's going to be a return to a more traditional approach, and they've most likely taken note of the fact that Biden did not decide to accept the congratulatory call from President Tsai Ing-wen. And so, the risk is that if Biden wants to advance, things like a free trade agreement, he may be bumping up against kind of reset Chinese expectations on what we are, what are going to do or not do.
Okay, so I have a question, Jim. So if Tony Blinken asked you some advice on Asia, and rejoin the TPP being very difficult, notwithstanding, because it's kind of free trade agreements are difficult. How would you recommend they go about to sort of rebuild a counter to China? with our Asian treaty allies and with the Southeast Asian bloc. The sort of things that we were working towards very strongly before Trump took power.
Mhm. Well, what I would want to see is multifaceted engagement, right? And that means that you have diplomatic engagement. That means you have strong security, military to military engagement. You have strong commercial engagement. So even if you're not negotiating trade, agreements, you're finding ways to increase the presence and investment of U.S. companies in the Indo-Pacific and their companies investing in the United States. You rebuild some of the people-to-people initiatives, whether that's education or Fulbright or Peace Corps, right? I mean, these are all areas where we have comparative strengths vis-a-vis China. And if we're not promoting those, then we're basically ceding ground and ceding the stage to the Chinese. I think, in terms of, so, in each of those areas, right, the thing is you can have multiple tracks of engagement taking place. They don't all rely on the same official, and they do matter. And so, my recommendation would be to make sure that you're doing that, right? It doesn't all have to go through one channel or one cabinet official. Of course, it goes back to my point being that you need to have assistant secretaries and undersecretaries in place in order for that to happen. So that'd be one. I mean, two would be, we really do need to kind of reopen the channels of communication with allies. There needs to be a true sense that these are cooperative engagements, that we want to find ways to kind of strengthen either mutual security or economic growth. And our allies are by far the most important thing. They are a force multiplier. And so if our alliances aren't healthy, then we're at a much weakened position in the region. I think you need to invest in, bilateral engagement channels, probably starting with the major players, whether that's Japan, India, Australia, ASEAN as a grouping, and rekindle some of the initiatives that had been in place in the Obama administration. And I do think, look, there does need to be a trade component. There are ways to talk to the CPTPP members and say, look, let's just have a discussion and to try to find out, where there would be willingness. And so you can show interest without kind of declaring a full-blown negotiation that we're rejoining. And I think that would be worthwhile. Though one of the challenges that the administration is going to face is the lapse of trade promotion authority, which is, probably a bit arcane, but basically what it does is it gives the executive branch, the ability to negotiate agreements and then send them to Congress for a thumbs up or thumbs down, no amendments. And that's a huge difference, right? Because if you're negotiating with the US, you want to know that the deal that is struck is basically the deal that's going to be voted on, and that 100 senators aren't going to be able to pick it apart. And it's going to be difficult to get TPA through in the current political environment. So that could really hobble a trade negotiating approach.
Jim, just to follow up to that, we were talking about today. There was a survey done by, I think it was CSIS in Singapore. They do an annual survey of all the Asian countries, all the attitudes towards all the major powers. And the only country that right now that is less trusted than the United States was China. And China actually fell below the United States. The European Union was by far the most trusted. Mm-hmm. But, as we saw when Obama came to power, these opinions of the United States can change drastically. Do you think that in the next year Biden can build up that U.S. reputation again, and that people will see the United States as a positive alternative to China?
Yeah, look, I do think it's, they tend to be pretty fickle, those types of surveys. So I do think that they can be changed quickly. As I said, at the start, I think that the big question is what is the overhang, And, what is the degree of skepticism? I always tell people that the day that we know we've really lost it is when you go into any developing country in the world and you've got 100 immigrant visas to the US and 100 immigrant visas to China, and you throw them in the air and everybody runs to the Chinese side. That is the day we will know we have truly lost it. And I don't think we're any close to that. Most people still want to send their kids to study in the US. If they had the chance to immigrate to the US, many would consider it. Certainly many would not consider immigrating to China. And so we have a strong source, enduring source of admiration from the world. As you know, from the work that you did, right? Public diplomacy is incredibly important because, I mean, the US is it's a complicated place to watch and understand. And Asians, as most other foreigners, right? I mean, they project their own systems onto ours. And so they draw oftentimes inaccurate lessons from kind of what is happening in the United States. They don't understand the concept of, the 50 states versus they don't understand the federal system. I mean, I happen to think that COVID would have been a complete disaster here, regardless of who was president, because he still would have had many governors who would have been able to resist, any kind of an attempt at a consistent approach across the country. But we need to get out there and we need to engage. And the challenge with the Indo-Pacific is it's far, and the Chinese are close, and they're there all the time. They are throwing lots of money around. They have an army of state-owned enterprises that they can send around to build things and not necessarily make any money at it. And we just have to be more expeditionary in terms of how we approach our engagement, and we can't take folks for granted. And so, yes, the short answer to your question is we can turn it around, but it's not something that just, kind of happens on its own.
Well, Jim, we have comments from the audience that you were terrific, and and you definitely were.
I definitely know I speak for all of our participants when I say what a fantastic job you did enlightening us. And as we think of U.S. foreign policy, China certainly remains a priority. I know pivoting to the new presidential administration, we will all be watching. Thank you so very much. We hope that you have a wonderful Thanksgiving and a very happy holiday, a new year, and we will see our participants again in January.